In this video, we'll discuss how you can add multiple markers to a map control in a UX component using client-side data. So Action JavaScript has for a long time offered an option to add multiple markers to a map, but the data has always been server-side data. So if we go, for example, over here and we look at this first button over here, and we open up the Action JavaScript editor, we see that basically the action has been defined here, and a new option is now available called either server-side data or client-side data. So previously this option wasn't present because the implication was that the data would always be server-side, and you can see here we've specified the data series name that is going to provide the data for the markers on the map. So if we go ahead now and we run this component in the browser and we click this button over here, let's just refresh so that there's no starting markers on the map, and we click this button to add multiple markers, you can see that an AJAX callback is made to the server to go and fetch the data that will be used for the map markers, and then you can see now that the markers are placed on the map. But if we refresh this now and we use these buttons over here which use client-side data, you can see here that the markers are going to be added to the map, and there's going to be no server-side callback, so there's no AJAX callback to go and fetch this data. So in this case we've basically defined a JavaScript function to provide the data for the map, but we can also use the data that's in a list control. So let's go ahead now and run this. So we'll go ahead now and use the data that's in this list control to populate the map over here, and again when we click this button, we'll see that there was no AJAX callback to the server to go get the data for the map. And then finally, in this last option, we're going to use the data in a client-side data cache to get the data for the map. Now this is a little bit more complicated because when you read data from a client-side data cache, that process, the reading of the data is done asynchronously. So we'll go through how this is actually accomplished, but you can see here basically we've got a little JavaScript alert here that tells us that the data has now been read out of the client-side data cache and put into a variable, and then we're going to basically go ahead and populate the list. So what we've shown over here is the various actions that add multiple markers to the map, either with server-side data or client-side data. And now we're going to, in the next video, go through how these various actions here were defined to use client-side data for the map markers. Thanks very much. So we're continuing now with our video describing how you can use client-side data to add multiple markers to a map control in a UX component. So for example, here is an action that is going to basically use client-side data to populate this the markers on this map. So let's go now and take a look at how this was defined. So we'll go back now to design mode, and we'll see that this action here has now been configured to use client-side data. So by default the option is server-side data, but now we're going to use client-side data, and we're going to specify that the client-side data is going to be supplied by a JavaScript function. So you can either specify a JavaScript function or the name of a list control. So we're going to just specify a JavaScript function. The name of the function will be called getData, and if we look over here in the function prototype, we can see that this function must return an array of JSON objects. So you can see here that the data that the function must return is an array. So you can see there's the array syntax, and then each item in the array is an object, and each object must have a value that supplies the latitude and a value that supplies the longitude for the marker, and then it can have as many additional properties as you want. So in this case, the sample data that we're showing over here has a property called name and city inside each object. So we've specified that there's a function called getData that is going to supply the data for the map markers, and then we need to just tell the Genie here what the properties are in the map marker. So we've gone here and we've specified that the get data function returns a JavaScript array that has these properties in each object in the array. Then once we've done that, we can continue to configure the action just as we would have done for server-side data. So we can specify which property contains the latitude value, which property contains the longitude value, etc. We can specify that the marker icons should be a built-in sequence, or we could also specify expressions that are based on the data in the array, or we can call a JavaScript function. So in this case we've just chosen one of the built-in sequences that Alpha offers, so we're going to use this sequence of pink icons. Then we can specify the title for each marker. So the title for each marker is specified using a JavaScript expression that can reference data from the array that is being used to add the markers to the map. So in this case we've got a JavaScript expression that returns a string, so we can see there's a string marker 4, and then we're using the data for the current row from the map data. So we're using data row number name. So basically these are all of the available properties in the JSON array, and we can use any one of them inside the map title, etc. Here's the detail for the map, again specified using an expression, a JavaScript expression. So now that we basically configured our map, we can go ahead and run it. You can see also that we've specified that there's that the marker is draggable. We've specified that the animation should use drop, so the options are either drop, bounce, or false for no animation, and that the animation should last 2 seconds. That's 2000 milliseconds over here. We've also defined an event for on click and on drag in. So let's just go ahead now and run this, and we can go now, press this button, add the markers to the map. You can see that the drop animation was used, and if I click on a marker, basically there's the event handler being fired over there. So what we've shown over here is how you can use a JavaScript function to get the data for the map markers. In the next video we'll show how you can use a list control as the data source for the client-side data. So we're continuing now with a video describing how to populate a map with markers where the data for the markers come from client-side data, and we're going to discuss now how the data for the markers can come from a list control. So you can see here we have a list control with a whole bunch of markers. This represents data for airports in Massachusetts. So now I'm going to go here and click this button to populate the markers using the list control data. So you can see now that basically the markers get added to the map of Massachusetts, and you can see here all of the markers are shown over here. So in order to basically configure this button, let's go back now and look at the button, which is this is adding markers using a list control. And if we open up the builder, we can see that we're using again action JavaScript, and that we've specified that the data type again is client-side data, but this time we've chosen a list control rather than a JavaScript function. So the list control is specified there, and then the name of the list that we chose is list number 1, and then configuring the action is just like it would be for server-side data. So we basically bring up the picker here, and we can choose the property that contains the latitude data. Then we can go ahead and choose the property that contains the longitude data. So this list of properties here are actually the field names in the list control. And then we can specify the JavaScript expressions for the marker detail, and we can specify the JavaScript expression for the marker title, etc. And again, inside the builder here, when we define the JavaScript expression, we can reference any data fields in the array of client-side data and you can see here we've referenced the name property. So that's all that is required in order to basically make the list the data source for the client-side data. So again, here we'll go ahead and click this button, and you can see now that we've populated the list. So in the next video, we're going to talk about how the client-side data that is used to populate the markers on the map comes from a client-side data cache. In this next video, we'll talk about how you can populate the markers on a map control in a UX component using data in the client-side data cache. So this particular action here is a little bit more complicated, because when you read data from a client-side data cache, the reading of the data is done asynchronously. So let's go take a look now at how this was configured. So let's first go over here to our client-side data cache, and we can see that we have a client-side data cache item called getGeogData, and in this particular case the client-side data cache contains this static data over here. But of course the client-side data cache could be populated using a SQL query or an XBasic function. So there we have our client-side data cache, and now let's just go and add a button to the UX component to read the data in a client-side data cache to see what JavaScript is needed in order to read data out of a client-side data cache. So I'll go ahead there and click the add button, and then I'll type in client-side data cache, and then I'll go over here to my actions over here, and I'll choose read data, and I'll specify the name of the client-side data cache that I want to read. And then in my onSuccess function, I'll just go here and say alert read the data. So now that we've got that, let's go ahead and run that and then look at the generated JavaScript. So we'll go there now, and we'll run this now, and we'll click this button which says read the data. So now if we go over here and look at the JavaScript, we can see that the way that the client-side data gets read is by calling this, I'll just put a break there to make it more readable, but we call a function called get from data cache, and this function is an asynchronous function. You can see that it doesn't return any value, but instead in the onSuccess it calls a function over there. So and once the function, so you can see here it calls this function that says read the data or read the data. So basically, in order to use a client-side data cache which operates asynchronously, what we have to do is first read the data out of the cache and put it into a variable. And then once we have the data in the variable, then what we can do is in the onSuccess over here, we can call the action JavaScript to populate the map control. And the technique that we'll use for populating the map control will be client-side data, and we'll specify the name of a JavaScript function that will read the data from this variable that was populated by this function over here. So that's the technique that we're going to use. So first, you can see what we've done is we go here to action JavaScript, and we've defined an action to populate the markers on the map. If we go ahead and we edit this action, we can see that this action is defined to use client-side data, and the technique again here that we've specified is a JavaScript function, and the name of the JavaScript function in this case here is called getMapData. So let's go now and take a look at what getMapData does. So here's our JavaScript functions, and here's getMapData, and all that it's doing is returning the data that is inside this variable. So we have a variable here called dialog.object._mapData. So this is the data that contains the information for the map markers. So now we'll go to this button over here, which is add markers using client-side data cache data, and look at the action. So if we look at the action here, we'll see that the action here is to read a client-side data item. So there's our action. We're going to read this data cache item called geog data. And then in the on success, what we're going to do is we put up a message saying that we've read it, so we can actually get rid of this message. We don't really need it. And then you can see we put the data into a variable, and then we call action JavaScript to populate the map using a JavaScript function. So let's pause now and pick this up in the next video. So we're continuing now with our description of how the client-side data cache can be used to get the data with which the markers on the map are going to be populated. So you can see here that in the on success, after we've successfully read the data from the client-side data cache, we have all of the data available to us in a variable called data. And we're going to go ahead now and put that data into a permanent variable so that our action JavaScript can reference it. So basically we put the data into a variable called underbar map data, and then this action over here is going to use a JavaScript function that reads the data out of this variable in order to populate the map. So let's go ahead now and run that. So we'll save that, go over to working preview now, and then read data from the client-side data cache. And you can see now that basically the data gets read from the client-side data cache asynchronously, and then the markers on the map are added. So this technique that we've used here for using the client-side data cache as the source for the map markers can be used for any functions that read data asynchronously. So that would include, for example, a PhoneGap application that used a SQLite database to store all of the data that you might want to use to populate markers on the map. So when you read data from a SQLite database, that action too is also an asynchronous action. So the same technique would be used. You would use the asynchronous action to read the data from the SQLite database. You would then put the data that you've just read into a variable, and then you would use action JavaScript to populate the map using client-side data, specifying the name of a JavaScript function that read the data from that variable. So what we've shown in this series of videos now is how you can populate the markers on a map using either server-side data, which would mean that you're going to make an AJAX callback to the server to get the data for the map markers, or using client-side data. Thanks very much for watching.